God, the music here just gets better every week. Woo! This week's joke is by our own Deanna Vahuni. A man's talking to God, and he asks God, so how does 1,000,000 years feel to you? God goes, a second. How about $1,000,000? A penny. Can I have a penny? Sure, wait a second. Our introduction to turbocharging prosperity. So there is a reason that spiritual leaders throughout the ages have said you can't be spiritual and have money, that you have to be poor if you're spiritual. And the reason is they knew something we don't. And that is that being spiritual and having a practice of spirituality and being prosperous and having a practice of being prosperous is like riding a bicycle while playing the guitar. Not so easy to do. In fact, they thought it was impossible. But then along comes Dr. Ernest Holmes, and he knew something they didn't, which is it's not only not impossible, but it's way simpler when you break it down. There are two practices. There is the practice of spirituality in our lives where we deepen to oneness, and we want to embody that oneness. Then there is the practice of being prosperous, where we want to embody being prosperous. And then when you put the two together, your life starts to fly. But if you try to practice them as if they're one, it can get confusing and very entangling. Can you see that? Can you see how if you take two practices, like let's say you wanted to really get good at playing the guitar, and you wound up spending all your time riding a bicycle going, why aren't I getting better at guitar? Or you wanted to get better at the bicycle, and you're on the guitar, and you're going, why aren't I getting better at the bicycle? So if you don't recognize the fact that these two things are separate, it's easy to get them entangled. And in doing so, you don't set up the kind of separate practices it calls for, so that then you could bring it together, because those who play guitar while riding the bicycle really, really well, who have mastered both, they took them on one at a time and then put them together. They practiced them individually and then did some practicing of them together. But if all you're trying to do is practice them together, you wonder why you keep crashing. So the thing about all this is it comes down to something we call here embodiment. What we embody manifests. And how we get to embodiment is where we put our focus. What we focus on, we give power to. So it comes down to, what are you focusing on? Where are you giving your power? Because that's where you're practicing, and that's what you're beginning to embody. So that's why there are all these folks out there, like I was saying last week, who were born into money, and so few of them, no matter what they do with their lives, no matter how conscious or unconscious they are, it is amazing how few people are born into money and then die poor. On the other hand, there's tons of folks who are born poor, rise into money, particularly if they are in the fields of the arts, sports, and music, who then die broke. Embodiment. They have not mastered the art of embodying prosperity in and of itself for what it is. They embodied their art. That's why they were so good at it. They embodied their sports figure, whatever they did in sports. but they didn't embody prosperity. Where somebody born into money seems to, a lot of those folks most of those folks seem to just have it in them. They just expect to have money, and so it shows up. Even if they make nothing of their lives, even if they are depressed, they still never or rarely die broke. So this talk is called Turbocharging Prosperity. But as I was looking into prosperity, what I realized is the same goes for if you want to turbocharge your health, turbocharge your love in your life, your relationships. It's the same thing because it always comes down to the same thing, which is the simplified fact of embodiment. So what I want to walk you through today is the steps I have discovered that turbocharge, supercharge prosperity, health, or anything else you want. Are you good with that? Okay. Are you good with that? Yes. I want to make sure I'm on a topic that you actually care about. I mean, maybe you all have all the money in the world and don't need this kind of talk. Maybe you already have the greatest of health, and maybe you have the best relationship ever. But if one of those things is falling a little short, this may be useful. So the first thing is recognizing the abundance that always exists. If you don't recognize that you are surrounded every moment by abundance, that abundance is actually who you are in an abundant universe, start with the amount of cells in your body. And start with the fact that they're always reproducing and changing over every 7 years. So you have this thing going on already. You couldn't exist without abundance. How many platelets you have, how much blood you have flowing through you, how much water is in there, how much air you get to breathe. All these things are abundant, and if they weren't, you wouldn't exist. And the most interesting part of all of this was discovered by a scientist, and some of you have heard me talk about this, who discovered that actually life could have never happened randomly. A physicist who was an atheist discovered that the only way there could be enough carbon in the universe for life to exist is that it had some directive to do so. That randomly there'd never be enough carbon for life. And so there's enough carbon for life. It has to be an abundant amount for life to exist. It does exist. We are in this. It's in our DNA. Abundance is in your DNA. Imagine the energy it takes to not be abundant in such an abundant world. This is an astounding thing. We are surrounded, and how does that happen? How does that happen that in an abundant world, you may be not abundant, not prosperous? Well, it turns out it comes out to our perception of lack. Because what we focus on, we give power to. This is an incredibly simple teaching, and yet can be so difficult to follow in the times when things are the roughest. And yet, Dr. Holmes tells us that to abandon the truth in our hour of need is to not understand the truth. And yet, our insistence on abandoning the truth when we need it most pops up all the time, and that's what we're creating because that's the story we're telling. And it is our story that we've embodied instead of what it is we want. So, for instance, your bank account's empty and you can't afford something. And you say, I can't afford this. You have created a story about not being able to afford it. Well, Cliff, my bank account is empty and I really can't afford that. Really? In an abundant universe, you think that you have that lack just because you have the illusion of no money in your bank account? Do you really think that's real? Because if you do, you get to live an ordinary life because what we focus on, we give power to. What we embody is what shows up. So if what we're embodying is that our bank account is empty, then it is. You really do get to be right. And you get to build all the evidence you want to be right. And that's really the key here. How much evidence do you build around being right about your lack, your limitation? But Cliff, I really do have that lack. I really do have that limitation. Really? Because there are lots of folks who who may have the appearance of way more limitations, who have somehow turned it into something that is extraordinary. There's this guy whose name I wrote down, but I'm not going to go through my notes, who was born with and had his legs amputated at 11 months old. No legs. Guy wanted to be a runner. And everybody's like, what are you talking about? You have no legs. And he was like, I want to be a runner. So his mom said, okay, well, I don't know. Let's get him some prosthetics and let's see what happens. And he runs, and he runs, and he runs. He starts winning not just the disability races, but then races of non-disabled people, to the point where he makes it all the way to the Olympics. And everybody in the Olympics is going, wait, this is unfair. He has an unfair advantage. I mean, think about that for a second. I read that and I was like, oh my God. You know, they're like complaining. This man without legs is being like chastised for having an unfair advantage. The record in football for the longest field goal was set by a guy who was born with a club foot. Half a foot. "62 yards. So what disability and story are you telling yourself around it that is limiting your good? And how often do you tell that story? Because it makes a world of difference to what happens in your life, how you create your life, when you take a look at the story that you are saying is real. Whether it's about your health, your relationships, your work, your money. What story are you telling yourself? The only story that guy who wound up in the Olympics was telling himself was he was going to the Olympics. He didn't tell himself any other story. He knew he could do it from when he was a little kid. All evidence to the contrary, because when he was a little kid, nobody had a clue how to create the kind of prosthetic he would need to be able to get to the Olympics. I mean, think of all the pressure on those things and how they'd have to be tied to you and figuring all that stuff out. Well, somebody did because he made it. He made it because he said he would. He wasn't buying into any other story. What story are you buying into? So I'm 10. My life changed, turned upside down when I was 10. I was diagnosed with ulcerative colitis. And I was having to go to the bathroom between 16 and 20 times a day. That's more than once an hour for, your daylight hours. And I was really big into sports. And so getting through a baseball game or getting through a tennis match or any of the other sports I wanted to play might have been difficult. But what I noticed was, at that very young age, was that actually whatever was going on with me seemed to disappear once I walked onto the ball field. I made it through the game, 3-hour game. I made it through several sets of tennis. Whenever I was out there doing something I loved doing, all of a sudden, I didn't have the symptoms that everybody kept telling me I had that impacted me all the rest of my day. And I started noticing that. And then by the time I was a teenager, I was actually able to have it in this conversation with my condition, in and out of the hospital and all that stuff that was going on. I was actually having a conversation where when I wanted to get on a subway and ride 2 hours to wherever it was I was headed, letting my body know I was going to make it without the need of a bathroom. This was long before I got to a place of knowing anything about science of mind. This was long before I even thought about the fact that I could be healed. This was simply me getting a hold of the fact that so much of what I was dealing with was around fear. My fear of not making it to a bathroom was making things way worse. Do you have that going on in your life where you have this, whatever it is going on for you, and because you have that going on for you, you have fear around that it's going on for you, and you talk to yourself about that fear? Because the thing about sharing your story with others, okay, is every time you do that, you are also sharing it with yourself. Every time you want to tell somebody, I'm feeling this way, or I hate my job, or I have this horrible relationship, or whatever it is that's going on that you're wanting compassion for and wanting somebody to talk to you about and feel good with you around, what you're doing is actually feeding it power. So whatever good you might be feeling from your friend or is giving you those hugs or whatever, you're also recreating what it is you don't want, because what we give power to, what we focus on, we give power to, and ultimately that's what we wind up embodying, and ultimately that's what winds up showing up. And then we wonder why illnesses become chronic. So I did. I started wondering why my illness became chronic. And all of a sudden, now we're talking, 20, 30 years later, I wind up in a Science of Mind center. And I start learning this stuff, and I start realizing that all the ways in which I allowed my disability, because if you got to go to the bathroom 20 times a day, it can be a disability, used it in ways that actually weren't so bad. I had free pass at every school I ever went to get out of class anytime I wanted. Nobody ever messed with me around my friends and stuff, around who got to use the bathroom first. And people, kind of felt sorry for me and did stuff for me and moved out of the way for me. And so with all the ways in which it was, harming and limiting my existence in life, there was also things I was getting out of it. What do you get out of yours? Because if you can recognize that, you can start seeing how you might be using whatever limitation you have. Maybe it's, I'm too old. Maybe it's, I'm too young. Maybe it's, I'm not flexible enough. Maybe it's, I just don't have that energy anymore. One of the things I started telling myself that was really helpful, because I was for a while saying, God, I feel exhausted. And then I was like, wait a minute, I don't want to feed that. I don't care that I feel exhausted. I want to remember that I have all the energy of the universe at my disposal in this moment. And I started remembering that no matter how I felt, that I have all the energy of the universe. And what I noticed is when I started feeling tired and I remembered, which I'm still working on, by the way, I don't have this one mastered, but I see the difference when I remember. When I remember about that all the energy of the universe is mine, man, I feel it. There's an instantaneous shift that lifts me up in that moment, that's really available to all of us. So where are you telling your story of lack? limitation that is getting in your way. If you want to turbocharge your prosperity, health, and well-being. Now, in the ordinary world, you can have a positive attitude, tell your story, and slowly but surely you will move towards health. Because what we have discovered in this teaching is if you're 51% on the side of what you want, focusing on what you want, you will get there. But today's talk is about turbocharging. There's the ordinary and then there's the extraordinary. And in the extraordinary, what you want to do is not allow any of those thoughts or your story to stand. To remember every time you think something is real, to remember that you are a divine being that can rise above it in that moment. That is available at every single point of time. It is up to us to take it on, to remember to take it on, which is why we show up here to remind ourselves, because this is a really good place to be reminded. I know I get reminded by showing up here, and I need those reminders too, you know? It's like, I don't have this stuff completely down. I do have it, though, that I surround myself. I've created a life where I surround myself with people who all I have to do is see them and remember, oh, yeah, I got to rise. Oh, yeah, I'm a divine being. So recognizing where we think of lack. Another big thing around, here's an interesting thing that I've noticed, is that a lot of people who come to me to discuss prosperity, when they finally have an opportunity for that prosperity, say they don't have time. So even though they're going, yes, I stand for prosperity, the next thing they're talking about is how they lack time. And so that gets in your way. If you have lack in one area of your life, I guarantee it's seeping in. Because abundance, prosperity is in everything. It's in health, right? Prosperous health is really possible here. When we stand for the greatness of who we are, rise above to the divine. That's what's really possible. What we're talking about here today is a miraculous life, not an ordinary one. Because in the ordinary, we can go along and think what's going on is real, hold a positive attitude about it, and yes, it will still get better. If we have that positive attitude, if we visualize what it is we want, yes, it will get better. But if we want to talk turbocharging, if we want to talk supercharging, if we want to talk really making this thing happen, then you really don't have, then it's time to step above wasting time in your story and rising up to a place where every single moment you remember you are divine. And when anything comes along that says otherwise, you go, wait a minute, that really isn't true for me. So it doesn't come out of your, when somebody asks how you're doing, you don't go in, well, this is going on, and I've got this ache and pain, and well, my job, my boss is just driving me crazy and all this stuff. Instead, you simply say, up to this moment, I have yet to embody health. I have yet to embody prosperity. That's it. No story. But that would be true. Because if you had embodied those things, you'd either be healthy or prosperous and all these things. No story. So it is, my wife and I, she was great this week. She kept hounding me. If we're not supposed to tell our story, then what are we supposed to say? And we kept bouncing that back and forth, and it took all week. It was just this morning, actually, that I finally came up with, since it's about embodiment, let's keep the thought there. What have you embodied and what haven't you? If you're having trouble with your boss, you haven't embodied having the perfect and right job. If you're having trouble with your health, you haven't embodied yet having great, perfect health. But then you are in a place of responsibility where you know that your work is about embodiment, because this teaching has never said, change your circumstance, change your life. Right? That's not what we teach here. What we teach here is change your thinking, change your life. Change what you embody, change your life. You know when you've embodied it because that's what shows up. What we focus on, we give power to. Where do you want to be given your power? So that's what we're here to do. We're here to rise up, to know better, to remember where the divine, so that we can turbocharge and see the miracles that are available. I mean, having a miraculous life. So I went from having that disease when I was a kid to walking into a doctor's office and going through all the tests, and the doctor saying, this is impossible. You have had this disease for over 30 years. There should be scar tissue in there up the wazoo, and there's nothing, as if it never existed. That's what happened. The doctors were so freaked out that when I asked them for copies of the before and after photos, they said they lost them. So I'm not standing before you here with this being some sort of theory that is out there. I am telling you this happened to me. And because I know that I am not that extraordinary a guy, I'm just a normal Joe like everybody else, that means it could happen for you. Miracles are abundant. They're not, how the Catholic Church says, once in a blue moon or whatever, or even less than that. No. It's an everyday occurrence because we have the power. We have the power within each and every one of us to dive into where the divine is, hold our consciousness accountable, and say, this is where I create from. This is the spot I create from. My consciousness. Nothing else gets to have say over my life but me. And I stand in that place, and I offer that you stand there with me. Let's stand there together, continue to grow, and enrich our lives with the miracles that are absolutely possible. Thank you. All right, take out what you're going to give. Hold it in your hand. Unfold it. Uncrinkle it. This is power. This is God too. The more you give, the more you receive. This is where it begins, that whole process. The law of circulation starts here with our giving. We give this so that we can receive abundantly. We give in the knowing that there is abundance in our lives always. That's why we uncrinkle it. That's why we hold it in our hands in a prayerful way, because this is God too. Normally it would be up here, but it is in your program. If you look in your program, you will see our prosperity affirmation. God is the source of all supply. Money is God in action. What we give, we receive multiplied abundantly. All that God is, I am. And so it is.
So it is.
You are the face of God. I hold you in my heart. You are a part of me. You are the face of God. You are the face of God.